Welcome to the Unpacking It podcast with Bryce Johnson. It's a show that unpacks sports, faith, and life with intriguing guests from the sports and entertainment world. Enjoy inspiring conversations and thought-provoking interviews. You'll hear stories from people that will inspire, challenge, and encourage you. Now, from the Unpacking It studios in Charlotte, North Carolina, uniting sports fans everywhere, here is Bryce Johnson.
Welcome to the Unpacking It podcast, where we unpack sports, faith, and life. Today's guest is former Army Ranger and author Stephen Elliot. He graduated from Oral Roberts in 2003, and 3 weeks later, he began Army basic training at Fort Benning. He became a member of the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. He joins us today to discuss his book, War Story. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. At its core, War Story is a dramatic, personal encounter with war and faith, love and tragedy, and ultimate renewal. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well and really excited to share with our audience today your story. And it is a story of renewal and what God has done in someone's life, but it's also very difficult, and there's a lot of pain and heartache to share as well. And so we'll discuss the story of how you're one of two Army Rangers who are considered likely to have tragically fired the shots that ultimately killed former NFL player Pat Tillman. But before we get to that, I'm curious, what led you to join the military and for you to take those steps right after graduating from Oral Roberts?
Yeah, I was going into my junior year at business school at ORU when 9/11 happened. So that definitely sort of shifted some of my thinking, quite a bit. And certainly we live in a world where, anymore it's very much a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11 world as far as so many things that have changed because of that event and all that's come as a result of it. And so for me, I think I started just asking myself a lot of questions as far as what was my life going to amount to, and what was I here to do, and what was I here for. And I saw, I think to some degree, military service as a pathway to manhood. I'd like to say that all of my intentions were purely about service and purely about a response to terrorist attacks, which is partly true. I was angry and felt like we needed to do something about it and wanted to be part of that. But I think I also wanted to prove to myself that I deserved and belonged amongst the ranks of people who called themselves men. I didn't really have a dad in my life growing up. My grandfather, my mom's dad, sort of filled that role, and he himself was a World War II vet. He had served in Italy for a year and a half, and I think I always saw to some degree, and he was surrounded by a lot of peers who had also served, and so I think to some degree I saw that sort of class of person that they went in, they did what they had to do, and then they went home and went about the business of their lives. And so I think it was a combination for me. It was a combination of certainly the events of 9/11 and then also myself sort of wanting to use military service as sort of a self-imposed rite of passage, if you will.
Wow. And so I guess early on, then, what was the experience like? And was it living up to what you thought it would be? And we'll talk about maybe the defining moment, but just kind of initially, what was the experience like?
It was terrible.
From the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. Which was pretty much, it's as advertised to some degree. I mean, you're going in to, for me, you start off. It's the path to be, an Army Ranger is sort of inverted from that of the Navy SEALs, where in the Navy doesn't have any other infantry units other than the SEALs. And so when you go into the Navy, you go in as hey, I'm going to be a radar technician on a submarine. And then I opt to go to this selection course called BUDS. And then after you get through selection, then they basically teach you how to be an infantryman. In the Army, it's the reverse, where you start off doing all of your basic, all of your infantry school, your airborne school, and then the last stage before you actually get assigned to a unit, which in this case the 75th Ranger Regiment, is the Ranger selection process. So it was kind of just it's just kind of a miserable experience, to be honest with you. So you spend a lot of time waiting around, and if you're not waiting around, you're probably getting yelled at, and if you're not getting yelled at, you're probably doing push-ups while getting yelled at, or some combination of all of those things. And so, it was pretty much like that. And then it felt like it didn't really get started in a way for me, because all of that was a pretext for I had joined to go through Ranger selection and hopefully become part of the unit. And so you spend like 5 months just in the build-up to actually going to Ranger selection, which at the time was called RIP, the Ranger Indoctrination Program. And so that actually happened. It felt like we finally got going, that fall of 2003 after having been at Fort Benning for a number of months. And so, it's challenging, and it's jarring. I think anyone who's been in the military or frankly, been in prison for some period of time, there's similarities, and I haven't been in jail, but having talked to guys who have and who've also been in the military, that's kind of what happens. You leave your life behind you. You leave your identity behind you. Drill sergeants don't really care what your GPA was, and you're sort of all the scores of life, so to speak, are all sort of reset to zero for everybody, which is a good thing for some and not a good thing for others. But it's a very much a cultural culture shock, and it doesn't matter how many movies you've watched or how much you think you can prepare yourself for that. Like most things in life, you can't really know what that's going to be like until you're right in the middle of it, until you're experiencing, the homesickness, or you're experiencing, just the annoyance and frustration of, and I think that was the biggest thing for me, was just taking for granted how much of a free agent in life I really was, where, I have obligations, but you know what, if I really didn't want to go to that accounting class, I didn't have to. If I really didn't want to do that thing, I honestly didn't have to. There was no one going to kick my door down and yell at me for that. And in infantry basic training, that's not how it works. And so that was just, I think, a massive adjustment for sure as you integrate into a totally foreign culture.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing all that. And I think it's just important for us to be reminded of all that it entails, and all that you go through, and all that you give up, and all that we kind of gloss over maybe, and just the day to day. And you talk about not being a free agent. I think that's very well said. And along those lines, we got to talk about Pat Tillman, because he was, respected because he left the NFL and he gave up a lot. But the reality is, all of you guys that leave and serve give up something. But he was, well known, and it was a big story. And so he was assigned to the same platoon as you. And so how was he viewed by the other guys? And what was your relationship like with him?
Yeah, when I got to 2nd Platoon Alpha Company, 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis in the fall of 2003, Pat and Kevin had already been there for a while. They'd already deployed with the platoon on what was at the time their first deployment to Iraq, which is crazy to think about that now, 18 years on. So this was, everything. When I got there, the company had just they had just gotten back from their first deployment to Afghanistan, just experienced their first KIA, and had deployed to Iraq once. And since then, I don't know how many dozens of deployments to both of those areas of operation the battalion's had, but it's been a lot. And so they'd been there for a little while. They were, more or less, settled in. I was assigned to the same squad as Kevin, Pat's brother. So we were both in weapons squad. We were on part of the machine gun teams for the platoon. And they were Ranger regiments, at least my experience with it and the leaders that I had, they're really no respecter of people. You go in, you do your job, and you go home. And as long as you can do your job well, nobody really cares about your politics. They don't care about your fashion. They don't care about your music. It doesn't really matter. It's we're unified around a common task and doing that task to the best of our ability. And so, there was nothing that was treating, Pat or Kevin any differently than anybody else. They were both hardworking guys who showed up. both pretty understated. They weren't loud or they weren't obnoxious. They were just good guys who very much obviously enjoyed the company of one another, for sure. Pat in particular, and Kevin too, but both of them were just very voracious with respect to detail and wanting to do their jobs well. And so, I experienced that with Pat. I was as we prepped for our 2004 deployment to Afghanistan, I was named the platoon language specialist for Pashtun, which was hilarious because I'm not a Pashtun speaker, but I got sent to language courses for a week and got a crash course on all the key phrases that you need to know as an Army Ranger with Pashtun. And Pat was hilarious because he would not leave me alone in terms of wanting to go over dialect and wanting to go over, like, he just wanted to get it right really, really bad, which was great. And it was also kind of sad in a way because I was a lousy teacher. I mean, I could only offer so much, but those are the types of guys they were. They were just, they were really good. They were really helpful. They were really down to earth, and they were, a pleasure to work with.
Oh, no, that's great to hear. And Stephen Elliot, our guest right now on Unpacking It, former Army Ranger and author of War Story. And a big part of your story is being involved with the situation that ultimately saw Pat Tillman lose his life. And so I encourage people to check out the book and read the full story. But can you just kind of sum up what ended up happening to Pat Tillman and your involvement that day with what ended up happening?
Yeah, so we had deployed to the Afghan-Pakistan border in early April of 2004 as part of a spring surge, so mountain passes between tribal regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. They open up, and folks are able to move much more freely, and so our forces respond with putting more boots on the ground to meet that. So we were there to do raids and patrols along the Afghan-Pakistan border, and having done that for a few weeks, finally on April 22nd of 2004, after our platoon had been split to accomplish two different objectives, one half of that platoon, the half of the platoon that Pat was in was, the half platoon we were in was ambushed, and Pat's half of the platoon responded to that. Unbeknownst to us, both elements didn't know where each other were because of lack of communication. And it's dark is beginning to descend. It's late in the afternoon, early evening, and the sun is setting, so lighting is poor. And ultimately, as we moved out of the kill zone, a canyon, we saw muzzle flashes and human shapes along the side of the ridge that appeared to be firing at us. And the ranking member of our vehicle, I was manning an M240 Bravo that was mounted on a Humvee, a stripped down Humvee. Our ranking member, a staff sergeant, opened fire. He fired on the individual who appeared to be firing at us. It turned out later that individual that he shot and killed was an Afghan military soldier who was fighting along with us, and he was shooting over our heads at enemy positions behind us. But in any case, he was killed, and then our vehicle, absent any other information, we keyed off of those shots, and we fired on that position as well. Pat was directly adjacent to that individual. Pat was ultimately killed as a result of that, and then the Afghan soldier was killed, and then two other members of our platoon, the platoon leader himself, a lieutenant, and the radio operator, they were both wounded. And all of those casualties we learned within 24 hours. It was pretty much known throughout the platoon that all of those casualties were sustained as a result of friendly fire. And so that's sort of the shocking traumatic event that occurred there on April 22nd. And then we came back to the FOB, and there was critical incident debriefs, and there was investigations that started and those sorts of things. And then again, it was there was no question that it was friendly fire. We were told to tell the investigators the truth as best we knew it, and we did. And then we went back out and did some more missions, and we came home. And so, yeah, that was. And at the time, you're in a state of shock as far as you don't have any context for war anyway. That's your first time doing that and being engaged in that act, and then you certainly don't have any context for this thing called friendly fire and how to process that and what that means. But that's what happened in April of 2004.
Gosh, it's a tragic story, and you can hear really all the details in the book War Story by Stephen Elliot, our guest today on Unpacking It. And the part of the title is sometimes the real fight starts after the battle, and so you mentioned initially it was hard to process. You don't really know. Oh man, it's hard to just soak in, and you're on to the next thing and that sort of thing. So at what point then were you able to process it, and ultimately when did really this affect you the way that it did, that ultimately led to some major personal spiritual issues that you encountered?
I was numb for a long time. When we got back, it was a series of false senses of closure. You do these investigations in Afghanistan, and then you're back out doing raids. So you're just like, well, I guess that was it. I guess we're done with that now. And then you go back home, and then you realize that actually the military was lying to the family. There's no other. I'd love to use another word, but that's exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And so then that blows open a whole nother. It just makes anything worse, right? Whenever a tragedy is bad enough, but when we deceive somebody about the tragedy, we just compound it. And so then there's more investigations, and then I'm one of the guys who is released from the Ranger Regiment as a result of that incident, and sent back to the big Army. And part of that was I didn't want that to happen, but at the same time, I kind of welcomed it in a way, because it was just like, well, maybe if this will get me further away, I was sick of the Ranger Regiment at the time, at least our leadership, because it wasn't just what happened on the ground, but then it was everybody felt a sense of betrayal as far as how it was handled with the family. So in a way, I was sort of like, well, good riddance, great, that's fine, get out of here. And by probably within 4 to 6 months after leaving regiment, settling into a different staff job, working for a general officer, actually on the East Coast and in the Carolinas, that's when the shock started to wear off, and that's when the after effects and really the early signs of post-traumatic stress disorder for me really started kicking in. So it was nightmares, it was a lot of sleeplessness, hypervigilance, and then ultimately just self-medicating with alcohol to try and take the edge off. And so kind of as that unfolded, I'd grown up in church. I couldn't have told you the difference between my cultural understanding of Christianity and my actual personal understanding and relationship with God, because those were pretty well intertwined. And as that period unfolded, you can blame yourself for so long before you start blaming God. And I felt that my theology, which at the time, and not to say that it's great now, but my theology at the time sucked, because I was basically, the way I think of it, I think a pretty effective prism to understand kind of who I was and the journey that I was on was really the prism of the prodigal son, the two sons, where you have I was going into the deployment in April 2004. I was the older son. I was the one who was checking all the boxes and who really, really liked the idea that essentially if I do enough good things, whatever that means, and if I perform well enough, then it's kind of written in the contract that God's supposed to bless me, and that life's going to be good, and that I'll prosper, and that those around me will prosper, and I'll be doing good things, and so on and so forth. And then when that doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen the way that you think it should, the castle that you've been building in the sand is sort of washed away, because that's what I had. Then you're left with a gap, and I didn't respond very well to that. I was the older son who basically stormed away and said, you know what, if that's the way that you run this place, you can have it.
Wow.
I'm going to be over here doing my thing. On one hand, that helped, because then you were freed from trying to reconcile these two tensions of an all-loving creator with a fallen world and pain, which is a very difficult thing to reconcile sometimes. You don't have to reconcile that anymore, because he's just not there. He just doesn't care, but it doesn't really matter. But not surprisingly, that doesn't do much for you in other aspects of your life. And so I doubled down on my self-reliance. I doubled down on my own ego. I doubled down on my own ability to perform and my own ability to, be a good person. And things got worse.
Wow.
And I did that for, the better part of 10 years before, got to a place where, my wife and I, we went through separation, divorce, and ultimately remarriage. The Lord brought us back together, and but for me, it had to get. I believe now, on the other side of a lot of that it wasn't so much that God had this dark journey that I had to walk. I chose to walk it, and I don't think it was a 10-year journey. I think Stephen made it a 10-year journey.
Wow. Yeah,
because
that's
of
good.
choices that Stephen made.
That's good.
And so I'll probably never know all that, and maybe it doesn't matter. But I think my pain and my frustration, to some extent, was directly proportional to my pride. And the longer that I chose to effectively not give up, and on a spiritual level, just even acknowledge the Creator, and then on a practical level, which is just even inviting other people into the conversation of dealing with the after effects of war, because I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. I did that some, and it just felt like a big waste of time. So it's like, I'm going to go to your office for an hour and talk to you about problems, about things that happened years ago, and it just feels like I'd rather not. So there was a lot of that, and a lot of it for me was just, it was a long, dark road that was, I think, to some extent, self-imposed because of my own choices.
Wow. No, there's a lot there to unpack, and again, appreciate you sharing all of that, and definitely want to talk about the remarriage, because I just love that aspect of the story. But when it comes to the alcohol, the PTSD, in another interview, heard you talking about suicidal thoughts. So take me into the spiritual transformation, because here you were. You mentioned the dark path that you were on, and ultimately have an understanding of who God is, how much He loves you. So maybe take us into some of that and how He ended up changing you from the inside out, and ultimately addressing some of these major issues that people can relate to in different degrees.
Yeah, it was definitely a process. There wasn't. There was moments along that journey there where I could mark significant differences. But what I would say is that he has a tendency to work through people. And what I mean by that is, we don't realize. I believe that we live in one of the most hyper-individualized cultures that the world has ever known.
Oh.
It is so easy to be a quote-unquote independent person in the West than it ever has been, in terms of sourcing your money, sourcing your food, sourcing your rent, whatever it is. I mean, you can do it on your own, or at least you think you're doing it on your own, when in reality all of us exist within the net of a community, even if that community is our Uber driver and the grocery store down the street. It requires lots of people for each of us to survive, and I can say that I think there's times where, man, I just wanted God to zap me while I was in private praying, and I could go into the prayer closet a mess and come out all cleaned up, and nobody would know the difference.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's generally how He works.
No.
And at least it wasn't how He worked for me. And because the underlying issue again for me was pride, and so half of the problem for me was just being willing. Half of the sickness was just a reticence to even ask for help, let alone receive the help. And so, for me, I had to get to a place where I could, just raise my hand and say, I'm sick. I'm not doing well. Like, it's not normal. You're not supposed to drink a bottle of wine every night and then fall asleep. Like, that's not good for you. And so, spouses, at least my wife is pretty good about kicking you in the shins and saying, hey, that's not okay. This isn't going to work. Yeah, I mean, there was lots of moments along the way like that, but, after we got remarried and the fact that I had post-traumatic stress, that was named. And then it was a process of just really, for myself, it got worse. Just my own sleep deteriorated, my health deteriorated because I was working a ton and was still suffering with the after effects of that. And ultimately, I found myself, at a place where, the Lord brought me to my knees and healed me. And that was a very dark and a very scary and a very hopeless place, because that's where I had to get to allow Him to do the work that I think He wanted to do. And so, so that happened, 3 or 4 years ago. And then, since then it's, I have problems, and I get irritated with people and they get irritated with me, and I have good days and bad days. I don't have what I was carrying around for so many years, and that's just but for the grace of God.
Amen. Amen. Oh, it's so powerful. He's Stephen Elliot. The book is called War Story. Sometimes the real fight starts after the battle. And would love to hear just a little bit more about your remarriage, because it's just such an encouraging thing to hear about. And so maybe what was the key to that happening, and what can even be an encouragement to those listening today that may be struggling in their marriage or maybe have already gone through divorce?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, for us, we met pretty much right after I got back from deployment, or we started dating right after I got back from deployment, and then we spent the first 2.5 years of our marriage apart, which is not unusual in some military instances for us. And so then I got out in 2007, and I spent basically the last part of my enlistment blaming the Army for my problems, which is frankly, that's pretty easy to do because the Army has got a lot of problems. And so it's a big bureaucracy, right? And it's easy to take pot shots. But our whole narrative was, well, once I get out of the Army and get settled into new life and new job, and all this stuff is gonna go away. And turns out it didn't. And so then we spent the first couple of years, me being home, basically in this state of disappointment, where it's like, well, our problems are still here. Stephen is detached, emotionally detached, and very withdrawn, which I was, because I was just kind of managing my own sickness and my own, demons from the past. And then finally she just said, you know what, I'm done. Like, I can't do this anymore, after having said that many, many, many times, that things need to change, that, why don't you talk to somebody? Why don't you do this? Why don't you just, this isn't okay. And after, saying that so many times, you can only say it so many times. And so we separated, and I moved out, and during that time started getting some counseling, and EMDR was at that stage in the journey was a helpful therapy for me. Didn't cure me, but it definitely helped me process some stuff. And then through that time, sort of what happened was, she had doubled down on her own independence, and had doubled down on basically, once Stephen's out of my life, everything for me will be okay. And it turns out that wasn't true. And so, we were both sort of coming to the place, we were both just coming to the end of ourselves. And I would say that marriage is great, but it is the hardest and most difficult thing that any human will do, because you're voluntarily agreeing to be joined with another sinner.
That's right.
And if you think for a second that person is going to complete you and fix you, you are wrong, because they won't. They can be a blessing to you, they can be a help to you, but that is only going to happen when each party is independently submitted to and relying on Jesus. Absent that, it's, the analogy that I think works pretty well is it's 2 ticks and no dog. And And that's essentially kind of what we were. And then through that time, there's all sorts of little, interactions along the way that sort of get you there. But it was basically, we had there was no malice between us. We weren't mad at each other. We were, heartbroken over something not turning out the way that we wanted. And all I can say is that we as fallen humans, we didn't have any raw material to work with. It wasn't like, I've got this mess of a thing and I just need somebody to put it back together again. I didn't have anything. It was a wasteland in terms of my emotional capacity, in terms of, all of that was needed to be a husband. And we prayed and we asked, and God was faithful, and He created something out of nothing for us. And I think that because I remember those feelings, I remember those moments of just complete and utter despair, where it's just like, well, this is dead. Like, I know what dead looks like, and this is dead. I'd say to anybody listening that, if you think you lack the power to bring life to your marriage, you're absolutely right. You're 100% right. You lack that power. But there's somebody who does have that power, and who can guide you, and who can breathe life into otherwise dead relationships. That's what He did for us. And even with that, it's also not to say that if you don't remarry the spouse that you're divorced or contemplating divorce of, it doesn't mean that there's not hope for you either, right? There is. There's hope all over the place, to the extent that we're willing to rely on Him. And there's healing, and that looks different for everybody as far as the journey that needs to be gone on for that. But we were a mess, and we still are a mess in our own ways, and yet we can look back and we can see that to the extent that we're not a mess, it's directly proportional to the extent that we are submitted to the Lord, and that we're inviting Him into the conversation. And when we don't, when it's all about what I need, and it's all about me bargaining and jockeying for power and position, it doesn't go very well. And so we're still on that journey. We're still learning, how to serve one another and how to serve the Lord together. So it is a journey. We joke that we already tried divorce and didn't really work for us, and so we're kind of stuck with each other as far as that goes.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the other thing too, is sometimes, man, the idea of divorce, it just sounds so good. I'm sick of this person, and if I could just get them out of my life and just move on, everything would be fine. And there's, in some aspects, that will be true, even in the most abusive and dysfunctional relationships, where maybe that needs to happen. Divorce is still, in any context, it's still death. It is still a death of something, and it may solve some problems, but I promise that it will create others. And so I don't say that to condemn anyone who is doing it or who is contemplating it, because wherever you're at in that journey, there's hope for a better future. It's just that's how our story, to date has turned out. And the only thing I can tell people is you have to quit trying to make it about you, and submit to the Lord. That's
right. Coming to the end of ourselves, and that's the key aspect of it. But man, I really appreciate that encouragement and just that honesty and transparency. And it's inspiring stuff from former Army Ranger and an author of War Story, Stephen Elliot. And kind of the last question, just almost in summary in many ways, is this idea that at one point you didn't want to be known and you didn't want your story to be out there, but now you do want your story out there. And so how did that mindset change, and how important is it for you to share, and you put it down on paper for this book, but for people to hear and know what you went through and ultimately what God did in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it changed because the 10-year anniversary date in 2014, ESPN came knocking and wanted to do an anniversary piece from the perspective of the shooters, because no one had ever done that. And so we contemplated that, initially said no, and then kind of got to thinking that, well, if this is just about talking about a tragedy that occurred 10 years ago and that's it, then what's the point? There's lots of sad stories you can tell. You don't need me to tell this one. But the thing that what was striking us about it was the fact that the mental health epidemic that exists in our country, it certainly exists within the military and first responder community, is not confined to people who perhaps shot and killed accidentally an NFL player. And so there's 20 plus veterans a day who commit suicide. There's many more who in the active duty ranks who make the same choice. We have had and continue to have a mental health epidemic on our hands. And so, I think I write it in the preface of the book, is that if this particular story, if war story matters at all, it matters not because it's unique, but precisely because it's ordinary. Because all of the other trappings, a young man full of idealism, going to war to ostensibly serve his country and then go on to live a full life, that story gets told every day and has been told for thousands of years. And then the story of what happens when you fail. What happens when others fail you? What happens when you hurt others and they hurt you? And what do you do with that? That is not a new story. And so we just kind of figured, if we have any sort of a platform, just because of my association with Pat for arguably some of the worst possible reasons, fine. What are we going to do with that? If all we're going to do is talk about the past, then it's a waste of time. But if we're going to use that story to pivot and talk about perhaps a better future, and to talk about the work that the Lord's done in our life, and to talk about specific changes that need to be made within the active duty military to better recognize and treat those that we're sending to war, then let's do that. And so then the story becomes a tool and a catalyst for conversation, and hopefully a catalyst for healing as well. And so that was the math. We did the interviews, and the feedback was very positive, and so it seemed like, and then I was invited to write about it, and so that was sort of how that's evolved, and the feedback. If people have negative feelings about the book, they're not talking to me, which is fine, I guess, because the feedback that we get has just been incredibly encouraging to see how it's being used in other people's lives.
Oh, it's awesome, and 100% of the author's proceeds will be donated to serving the mental health needs of the military and veterans community. So go check out the book. It's called War Story. He's Stephen Elliot. Stephen, thanks so much for sharing your story, for being willing to write the book, but then to join us today on Unpacking It and share it with our audience as well. And so we greatly appreciate it, and continued blessings to you and your wife, and you have 2 daughters. Is that right?
Yes.
2 daughters.
That's right. 17 and 7.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. I just had a daughter myself 2 months ago. So.
Oh man, congratulations.
So I'm fresh in the dad-daughter world. So.
That's great.
It's awesome. But thanks so much, and greatly appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce. Appreciate it.
Awesome. There's Stephen Elliot joining us here on Unpacking It.
For more information about the show, our events, and other resources, visit unpackinit.com. That's unpackinit.com. We hope you are encouraged, inspired, and challenged by what you heard today. To support our show and Unpacking It Ministries with a financial gift, visit unpackinit.com/donate. We look forward to unpacking sports, faith, and life with you again next week.